Welcome to this week's Nebraska Soybean Board's weekly market roundup. It's being brought to you by the Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. I'm Susan Littlefield. Variety of things that we're going to look at today on both the grain and the livestock perspective. We're going to see how we survived this crazy week that we had in the markets as we knew the ebbs and flows of both corn and the beans. What's happening basis-wise in the trade and looking at export numbers as well. Also, we'll look at Wall Street. What are some of their fears and how is that going to influence the way we see those markets?
It may be small, but this little bean fuels a lot of power. It powers a food industry as a top source of protein. It's a fuel that powers diesel engines with fewer emissions. It powers a state economy and bottom lines, and it powers the rest of the world as a top Nebraska export. Yeah, it may be small, but we're finding more ways for this little bean to power Nebraska.
Well, joining us now, as you can see on the screen, is Jeff Peterson. He is with Heartland Farm Partners, and Arlan Suderman with StoneX. And both gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on this Friday. And got to start out, I'll start with you, Jeff. Let's look at this ebb and flow that we saw in this week's trade. And at least we saw some positives to wrap up a Friday.
Yeah, it was interesting. We did the trade itself started off. We go back to last Friday. We had up and back and forth trade in the market, and it looked like for a while corn was really going to have some pressure, but did close stronger. But we came into the week, and overall the trade for the week down on the March corn down 7 3/4. As we look over to the March 2022 is down 10 1/4, and then we ended up on January soybeans were up 7 1/2. We did get some pressure out there on the No 22 beans for new crop. Did end up closing down 6 1/4 for the week, Susan.
What about for corn?
Overall, we'd have had on the corn side, we'd have had new crop corn down 10 1/4 for the week.
All right, Arlan, I want to know what's your thoughts on this wheat market, because it's definitely been an interesting trade for them as of late.
We've learned a lot about the wheat situation here over the last week. We learned that when prices get high, near the recent highs, it's going to get kind of frothy up there. We see demand pretty well shut down. But it takes, once we get a price break, that demand quickly comes back. And we saw the cash markets particularly heat up as millers tried to extend coverage on the price break. And even Friday, when the board was down, we were seeing pushes in some of the basis as mills are trying to get some coverage and trying to move some wheat. So the demand is there. We're trying to define, I think, a sideways trading range right now where we can kind of find value for wheat at current fundamentals. We're watching real closely the Australia situation as they're trying to harvest a crop amid persistent rains. If that continues to deteriorate their quality, that further tightens the world quality milling wheat situation. And so I think there's good value underneath of this market.
Export wise, what are we looking at? I want to ask you this about soybeans, Arlan.
Well, in soybeans, I'm very concerned. If you look at what China has on the books right now and what is currently on the books to unknown destinations combined, that's about 12 million metric tons, which is, we don't know for sure how much of the unknown destinations of soybean sales is to China. We anticipate most of it is. That's pretty much most of what China needs to get them to the first arrivals of Brazilian beans. And if you look at the FOB bids coming out of Brazil, Brazil beans are cheaper for us for Brazil for arrival into China as we get into February and March. So that means we have a very narrow window going forward. And if we cannot maintain a strong shipment pace through December into early January, I think we're going to fall short of USDA's current export target. I feel a little bit better overall at Chinese demand, but I think they're going to try to pull more of it from those cheaper new crop Brazilian supplies with the crop looking good right now. So we're really going to be monitoring those shipment pace here over the next 6 weeks.
All right, we're going to come back around to South America here in a moment. But for corn exports, Jeff, are we going to be able to keep a pace or at least get some profits coming for our producers?
On the corn export side, that's been one where it's been holding up a little bit better overall. And as we look at those numbers, our shipment pace has been, it's lower than what we need if you were to look at on a seasonal basis. So if you're doing kind of a pace analysis, but what it sure feels like is that as we historically do, as we move through the year here, we do go ahead and pick up our export inspections. We are lagging as we would look at it on a kind of a percent of where we're at compared to a year ago basis. But our belief would be as we go forward, especially with the higher prices that we're seeing out there on the feed wheat side, that we still should be able to go ahead and meet the export numbers that USDA has out there. And a lot of that also comes back to the fact that with the safrinha corn crop being smaller, there won't be as many bushels out there that Brazil will have to put out there in the mix. So it puts the U.S. in a better place than we would have been before.
Well, as we continue here at the Nebraska Weekly Market Roundup, it's being brought to you by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. I want to look at South America with both of you gentlemen. We've talked, both of you, this week extensively about what's happening to the South. And Jeff, first with you, what are you hearing from folks in South America as to where their crop is at?
Well, it's interesting overall as you look at the production side of it. I think everybody's holding pretty steady on what we're seeing for soybean production out of Brazil. Mato Grosso has had some very good conditions, and actually, well, the way it looks, they could have some record amounts of production going forward. However, as we go look a little bit further south, we get to the southern parts of Brazil. You look at Rio Grande do Sul, you look at Paraná, and with the forecasts that are coming up there, some are saying that we could see 15 to 20% of the Brazilian soybean production that could encounter some less than desirable conditions on the moisture side. And then we slide on down to Argentina, and Argentina, they have been faring and getting less moisture than what we've seen and what they've liked. It does look like there could be some additional conditions, rainfall coming into the western part of Argentina, the southwest part of Argentina, but it sure does look like we've got some dryness that's on the eastern part. And all of this for southern Brazil and also for Argentina would be very consistent with the pattern that we see with the La Nina. So that's a little bit about what we're seeing so far, Susan.
And Arlan, for you, you guys have kind of been crunching some numbers as well.
Yeah, our team down there does these monthly customer surveys to estimate the size of the crop, and they raised the size of soybean crop to 145 million metric tons, which is another record. That's a good crop for them. They've generally have had good rains, which, as Jeff said, in the south, that's where the problems are. And I think as we go forward and we see that dryness kind of expand over the next 4 to 6 weeks, we may take a little bit off the top in that southern crop, and that's what they found in their survey. But the north, we're going to see some yields bumped. Argentina is the bigger question mark, as Jeff indicated, with the dryness expected to intensify there going forward. They're mostly an exporter of meal and oil versus whole soybeans, so that changes the dynamics a little bit, but it still matters to the world balance sheet. And so it's something we're going to be watching very closely here going forward. Roughly half of the soybean crop is planted now in Argentina versus in Brazil. We're going to be harvesting the early beans here in a few weeks.
What about these outside market influences that we've seen, Arlan, on the grains and livestock alike? And you talked before we started about the Wall Street Fear Index and VIX out there.
Yeah, the VIX is the way we measure fear levels on Wall Street, and the VIX generally trades in the teens. It's popped above and sustained a move above 50 twice over history. Once was in the great financial crisis of 2008 in October of that year, and the other was during the pandemic. But generally, when I've observed over the years, and when it trades above 30, it's difficult to sustain a rally in any of the commodities unless they have a strong story at the time. We peaked above that to end the week. We rose to about 35 or so. That was a new 10-month high. And so that's something we're going to have to watch as we go next week. That may create some strong headwinds until we can calm things down. Mostly that fear is due to Omicron. So far, most of what I've read and heard on Omicron is generally mild symptoms, but it's very early. If that continues and it's just mild symptoms, then I think that we'll see those fears ease and we'll see the money coming back into the commodity sector, because the commodities, particularly the ag commodities right now, are seen as a good hedge against inflation in investor portfolios. And that tends to mean that we trade supply and demand fundamentals at a higher price level than what we otherwise would.
Jeff, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think what's really happened here with the Omicron and what we're seeing that was what was responsible for our volatility that we saw, late in the week last week. And it really, in my mind, also sent some fear through the market in the early part of the week that, caused our markets, whether it be corn, soybeans, and wheat, to go ahead and back off. And with that, we also saw it, the weakness that happened in the crude market. If you think about it, crude topped out on the WTI probably a little bit over 85, and we had a pullback clear back down to 62. So really, when we saw that type of pullback, I was really surprised that actually corn and soybeans held in as well as they could. I think what we've been seeing with the Omicron virus, so, is kind of masked a little bit what's going on in the weather conditions in South America. And I do think as we go forward there with the conditions that look like it's going to be a little less rainfall and maybe a little bit more heat than expected, to keep in mind we're kind of getting into entering the critical time. It's not that there isn't already some of those crops already either in the ear fill stage or pollination stage, or on the soybean size in the pod fill stage and bloom stage. But we're going to be, each day we go forward, entering a time in there where the weather is going to be more and more important. And I think if we can get comfortable with this Omicron virus, I think we'll get back to trading more of that type of information instead.
All right. Well, Arlan, we can't leave without talking real quick about what's been happening in this cattle market. Nice to see up $3 and the guys saying, hey, I want more money.
Oh, it's up about $18 on the cash market in the last 6 weeks. The feeders finally have a little bit of leverage. Now, there's some concern how well we can hold that with the board trading below the cash market at quite a discount. That would suggest that the board's skeptical whether we can hold that through the holidays and early next year, but it sure does feel good for the time being. And hopefully we'll be able to sustain that demand, sustain the economy, sustain consumer sentiment in order to keep buying those nice cuts of beef.
Yeah, well, hopefully it continues, and hopefully the prices at the meat counter, gentlemen, don't scare anybody away from purchasing more. Thank you so much to both of you. Arlan Suderman's joined us. He's with StoneX, and Jeff Peterson with Heartland Farm Partners. That has been this week's Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup. It's being brought to you by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. You can follow along on all our reports through our social media platforms. And as always, commodity futures and options do involve a substantial risk of loss, and they're not suitable to all investors. And that is this week's Weekly Market Roundup. I'm Susan Littlefield.